Hey, hi everyone. So this is one of the process domains that I will be talking about when we are preparing for PMP examination, and stakeholders is one of the most important uh, topics from the perspective of PMP preparation. And so before I start the video, the three resources that we need to use for preparing for PMP exam is PMBOK 7th edition and Rita's PMP guide. So these are the two books I have been following. I'm also going through PMBOK 6th edition as well, but since PMBOK 7 is the latest one, but 6th has a lot of breadth of material, so we can refer to 6th to look into specific details, specific subjects, specific topics. So I've compiled a very short few slides. The slides are not to be substituted for actual preparation or reading the books, but yeah, these will give a basic idea of how you need to prepare and what are the important topics that you need to dive deep into. So let's get started. Stakeholders. So as per PMBOK 6th edition, we used to have process groups such as initiation, planning, executing, monitor and control, and closure. So there's a 5-step process in a project which PMI has done away with in the 7th edition. But still, to understand stakeholder management, and for the sake of questions that are asked in PMP, we'll check how the different topics in stakeholder management, different activities map to each of these process groups. So identifying stakeholders, although it happens throughout the course of the project, but it gets started during the initiation phase. Planning of stakeholder management, of course, happens during the planning phase, pretty much straightforward. Managing stakeholder engagement happens during execution, and monitoring happens during monitoring and control period. Nothing surprising here, but yes, there can be questions like at what stage of the project does identifying of stakeholders take place? So the question will not be very much as easy as this, but it will be described in the form of a real life example. So we need to say that yeah, it's during initiation phase where we start identifying stakeholders. PMBOK 7th edition actually divides this into 6 groups. So basically identifying stakeholders, understanding and analyzing stakeholders, prioritizing stakeholders, which stakeholders should be prioritized over others at which point in the project, engaging them and monitoring them. So basically pretty much straightforward, but since they're doing away with the 5 process flow, they want to divide it in this structure. Now moving on to identification of stakeholders, understanding of stakeholders, and analyzing of stakeholders, we basically can do all this with the help of three salient models. So basically there's a power interest grid, there is a stakeholder cube, and there is a stakeholder salience model. So let me reduce the size of my video because it's entering the screen, move it to really bottom, yeah. And so basically we use questionnaires, surveys, direct communications, which are maintained throughout the life cycle of the project, and stakeholder register. So this is the most important part of the stakeholder management. This is a document, a tool, which is the only one in stakeholder management where we list all the stakeholders in the project, high influence, high power, low interest, all the kind of stakeholders, and how do we plan to engage with them and what their influence level interests are. A power grid and interest grid says us the level of power and interest and divides into 4 quadrants so that we can classify our stakeholders and deal with them accordingly. There's a stakeholder cube. So basically in power and interest you also add an attitude. So basically someone can have a very aggressive attitude, someone can be a more relaxing person, and someone can be easy to work with. So that is how you divide it into 3 groups. And you can have a very insignificant passive blocker. You can have a influential active blocker. So there's an influential person who is very active and he's blocking a project. So you need to pay close attention to these folks. Moving on to stakeholder salience model. It's also basically similar kind of things, all 3, but there are different models here, and you need to know these because there will be direct questions related to these in the exam. So studying these, we see that there are stakeholders with high level of legitimacy. These are legal people who are highly informed and have the power to legally, or they have a legitimate authority to block it, and they are very discretionary. Then there is a dominant, definitive intersection between power and legitimacy. So you have to understand in which quadrant each of the stakeholders fall. There are stakeholders who want things to move very fast, very urgent. I want to stop the project. I want this to go very forward. So you need to pacify them, give them clear timelines. of the project and how you're going to engage with them. So identifying this well beforehand helps you mitigate a lot of risks at a later point in project. We look at planning stakeholder engagement. So basically there's a planning stakeholder engagement is basically communication with stakeholders, and this happens pretty much instinctively. So basically, but if you give it a thought, you might want to engage informally with a few stakeholders. You might want to engage formally with a few stakeholders. You might want to have 1:1 with few stakeholders. You want to send a mail blast to a lot of stakeholders, but then you might want to exclude some of them from those mail blasts, or maybe inform them well beforehand before you send the mail so that there is not pushback on those. So that is how you prioritize and involve stakeholders with your communications. Now finally, how do you manage stakeholder engagement? So you manage them with the help of your stakeholder risk register, right? So you have a risk register and you have mentioned all the stakeholders who are there, right? So let's say that you have determined all the interest level, influence level, power level, legitimacy level for all the stakeholders, and you want every stakeholder at some place. You want some stakeholder to be least involved. You want some stakeholders to be actively involved. You want to work closely with some stakeholders, get their guidance, whereas there are some stakeholders who you just want to keep informed and make sure that they don't block your project. Just you want to keep them pacified, satisfied. So the aim of project manager is to satisfy the stakeholders, not to provide value to stakeholders, not to do anything else, but to satisfy. So satisfy is a correct word. That is the aim of a project manager. So all the stakeholders should be satisfied. They should not be pleased. They should not be given additional value based on the project. They should be satisfied. So let's say the chart over here shows different levels where you want the stakeholder to be. So basically one is ignorant or unaware, willing, and going from 1 to 5 is like principal or leading. So basically least interested to highly interested. And let's say that there's a stakeholder A who is at level 4, which is responsive or supportive, and you want him to be leading the project. So you have to push or strategize communications with him, speak to him that yes, I want you to drive the project. Similarly, stakeholder B is at position 2, which is unwilling or resistant. You want him to move to 4, and it can be the other way around also. There can be some stakeholders who are responsive or not supporting of the project, but you want them to be informed and go a step back. So you have to be very significant on how very clear, very clever about how you want to engage with different stakeholders. So more or less that is what is there in stakeholder management. And of course the risk register keeps changing. The stakeholders continue to change. Someone who is influential at this point in time might not be influential at another point in time. So you have to keep updating the stakeholder risk register at all the points in time. So make sure that you keep updating it. And there are a lot of things that you might not want to put in stakeholder register because it is visible information, and if by chance some of the stakeholders get to see that you are thinking them as a blocker of the project, that is not a good feeling. So there are a lot of stakeholder mapping that needs to be on in your mind rather than on the stakeholder register. But yes, stakeholder register definitely helps to keep an account of how to manage stakeholders, how to monitor them. So that is it for stakeholders. There will be a few questions that I'll be dropping on the link shortly. So do stay tuned and feel free to drop your comments. Thank you for today.